Okay, well, good evening to everyone who's here. We've already had some time to share, and for those of you who are using our daily offerings throughout this Holy Week as a part of your preparation for Easter Sunday, today we are taking a look at Holy Saturday. And so for today, I have two passages that I have selected for us to read, and the first is from the book of Lamentations. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 9, and then 19 through 24. And one of our new members, Susan Hinckley, has agreed to read this text for us. First off, I asked her if she got nervous reading scripture in front of people. She made the mistake and said no. So now we got her. Now we know.
Yeah, well, all right. Lamentations. I am the one who has seen the afflictions that come from the rod of the Lord's anger. He has led me into darkness, shutting out all light. He has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He has made my skin and flesh grow old. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and surrounded me with anguish and distress. He has buried me in a dark place like those long dead. He has walled me in, and I cannot escape. He has bound me in with heavy chains, and though I cry out and shout, he has shut out my prayers. He has blocked my way with a high stone wall. He has made my road crooked. The thought of my suffering and homelessness is bitter beyond words. I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss. Yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance, therefore I will hope in him.
Thank you very much. Boy, the first part of that Lamentations reading is bleak. It's tough. It's bad. This is a person who's just groaning and crying, and then they come to the point that say, yet I still dare to hope. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. And so our gospel lesson for this evening is from the 27th chapter of Matthew, verses 62 through 66. And Steve Ryland has agreed to read this text for us.
The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember what that impostor said while he was still alive. After 3 days I will rise again. Therefore, command the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may go and steal him away and tell the people he has been raised from the dead. And the last deception would be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can." So they went with the guard and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone.
The words of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, I don't know if you know it or not here this evening with a belly full of taco meat, but on Holy Saturday, we are thoroughly entrenched in something called the Triduum. Triduum, say that with me, the Triduum. How many of you, honestly, have ever heard of that phrase? All right, not many. The Triduum. Triduum is a 3-day period of time. Triduum is Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday. These 3 days. Now, for more than 20 years, I served churches that had a Saturday worship service and then Sunday morning worship services. And I was always wondering, what do we do on Holy Saturday? Now, some of my colleagues, out of necessity, because their sanctuaries are so small, they celebrated Easter on Saturday night. That always felt wrong to me. How do we celebrate resurrection with the setting sun? That's not Easter sunrise. So others have done prayer vigils, but no proclamation. What is there to preach on Holy Saturday? But I came to the belief that surely God has a word for us on Holy Saturday. Good Friday and Easter Sunday are perhaps the two most studied and talked about days in all of human history. Of the millions of days throughout history, these 2 days, Good Friday and Easter Sunday, with all of their drama, with all of their action, with all of their detail, have captured our attention, the attention of the world. There are two pastors in here, and I think they can kind of know what I'm talking about. When writing an Easter Sunday sermon, the preacher is reminded, and I have thought this myself, I'm writing something like the 1 billionth Easter sermon that's ever been written, and what's more, there is nothing new that I can add to this story. There is nothing I can add, and oh yeah, there is no language big enough to ever fully convey the topic of resurrection of Jesus Christ. One of my favorite preachers, John Buchanan, said, "The truth is that the steepest climb of the year for the preacher is up the steps to the pulpit on Easter morning." They say, "Oh, Pastor, it's your Super Bowl." Well, you know what? One team always loses in a Super Bowl. But year after year, those who have felt the call to proclaim good news have given our lives to this ministry of proclamation, share the good news of resurrection. But that's tomorrow. That's Sunday. Today is day 2. Today is Saturday. Today is the day after and the day before. And so what can we know about it? And so I've turned to scriptures. I've turned to the teaching of others. I've turned to sermons from preachers that I really admire, John Buchanan, John Ortberg. I've turned to the things I learned in seminary. I've turned to books that I have read. As we heard Steve read to us, they remembered that Jesus said after 3 days. And so they say, we got to make sure nothing happens. We got to make sure nothing happens. And so here we are left with Saturday. And so let's look at this day, this Saturday. It was Saturday morning. For our Jewish brothers and sisters, it was a Sabbath day. A quiet Saturday. Nothing happening, nothing moving, no one working, shops all closed. And in this stillness, a delegation of old men, and they must have been old men, a delegation of old men comes to the royal palace where the governor is staying. Now, this group of men were there yesterday, in fact, and now they're back. They are the exact same religious and political leaders who convinced Pontius Pilate that it was in his best interest, in the best interests of the empire, that this Jesus of Nazareth, this troublemaker, be put to death. And Pilate finally agreed, but without much enthusiasm for the project. He seems to have known that Jesus was innocent of the charges. And as he condemned him to die, what did Pilate do? Washed his hands of the whole affair. But that was yesterday. That was yesterday. His soldiers had carried out the gruesome business. And friends, I think we lose sight of just how gruesome crucifixion is. They had carried out the gruesome business of torture and crucifixion and finally reported the prisoner was indeed dead and buried. Dead and buried. They had completed their assignment before the sun went down on Friday and the Sabbath began. But now they're back. The same old men who wanted him dead, Your Excellency, his disciples are still at large. He wasn't alone. They're still out there. They could steal the body and claim that he rose from the dead, and then you'd have a real problem on your hands. Assign a cohort of soldiers to stand guard at the tomb. Can you imagine Pilate's impatience with this? These people, again, he would have been irritated. Would this matter never, ever end? He thought he was through with it. He must have been thinking to himself, I thought I had already literally buried this headache. But here they are. And so he says, you have a guard assigned to the temple. Use them and make it as secure as you can. You see, they're afraid that someone's going to steal the body and pull off the religious hoax of all religious hoax. But I believe what they're really afraid of is that what Jesus said, that in 3 days I'm going to rise again. I think in the back of their mind, they were afraid that somehow on the third day, he'd actually stand up and walk right out of that tomb. It was not totally unthinkable. After all, it wasn't that long ago that at the very command of the voice of Jesus, Lazarus, who had been in his tomb for 4 days, got up and came back to life and walked out of a tomb. Did death have no power anymore? And although they probably never mentioned it to one another, that was their real fear. Those old men who thought they knew everything there was to know about death, the power of death, the reality of death, the finality of death, the inevitability of death, the threat of death, and even how to use Rome to orchestrate a death of their choosing. So valuable an instrument of control, but what if death were dead? What if death were dead? What then? So they went to the tomb with a few soldiers, and they secured the tomb by sealing the stone. This was a secured place. Then the soldiers sat down and took turns guarding. Old men trying to do something as impossible as preventing the sun from rising. Sun from rising. Finally, when Pilate had finally agreed that Jesus must be executed, every one of his followers, Jesus' followers, fled in fear. And they found a safe hiding place behind a locked door. And they were going to stay there to wait for things to calm down until they could sneak away back up to Galilee, back up to the safety of their home. Just on Sunday, I talked about shame and the shame that Peter must have felt, having denied Christ 3 times. And so Saturday, for Peter in particular, had to be hell. Saturday, for Peter, had to be hell. He must have still remembered Jesus' eyes piercing his own eyes as the rooster crowed. No, for all the disciples, Saturday could not have been a pleasant day. Were they thinking Jesus was a failure? He did not have enough followers, that the chief priests were not converted, that there's still no peace with nor freedom from Rome? As they were sitting in that upper room, were they remembering all that he had taught? Were they able to remember his words about 3 days? I'll be back in 3 days. John Ortberg gave a great sermon on the topic of Holy Saturday in which he drew material he used to teach about 3-day stories in the Bible in his book, Faith and Doubt. Did anyone read the book Faith and Doubt? He really wanted to call it No Doubt, K-N-O-W, Doubt. I led a book study, and we read that book, and he talked about these 3rd-day stories. And the Bible's filled with them. We think of 40-day stories as crockpot stories, and 40 should be seen as the amount of time God uses to prepare God's people for God's purposes in their lives. Every time somebody's not looking forward to a 40th birthday, I say, oh, no, this is perfect. This is the amount of time God has used to prepare you for God's purposes in your life. But 3-day stories have come to mean something different. 3-day stories have come to mean a time to wait for deliverance. Right now, things are messed up. Right now, hope is being crushed. Right now, hearts are disappointed. But a better day is coming. And the Bible is filled with these 3-day stories. Abraham, tested with the sacrifice of his son Isaac, had his belief that God would provide, but it wasn't until the 3rd day. Genesis 22:4, on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Esther was told by Mordecai that the plans were in the works for a complete genocide of the Jews, to completely eliminate the Jews, unless she could intercede with the king. That's terrible news. She prayed and fasted for 2 days, and then Esther 5, verse 1 says, on the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace opposite the king's hall. And there she stood up for her people. Hosea, the prophet Hosea says, come, let us return to the Lord. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. So 3-day stories. Day 1 is a day of trouble. Day one is the worst day ever. Day one is a very dark day. Day two, Saturday, is the day after your worst day ever. Day two is the day after you've been told it's cancer. Day two is the day after your spouse leaves you. Day two is the day after finding out about the trouble that your child is having. Day two is the day after you've been told that your position is non-essential. Day two is the day after the accident. Day two is the day after the death, other than your own, that you have feared the most. Day two is a day of disappointment. And friends, if we live long enough, we're all going to have a day two in our lives. Maybe some of us have had a series of day twos. The day after the worst day ever. Day two is a day of silence. It's marked by silence. We may still be weeping or raging bitterly, two activities that are hardly silent, but it is marked by silence because it is God who appears to be silent on day two. C.S. Lewis wrote something called A Grief Observed, and it's a collection of observations as he grieved the loss of his wife, and he wrestles with the experience of God's silence during difficult times. Here's what Lewis wrote. Meanwhile, where is God? Where is God? It is one of the most disquieting symptoms when you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you are tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. He continues, the longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might as well be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once, and that seeming was as strong as this. What can this mean? And maybe the famous quote out of this is, why is he so present a commander in our time of prosperity and so absent a help in our time of trouble? Where are you, God, on day two? And no one is immune from this, not even spiritual giants. You know, one of the spiritual giants kind of in recent history was Mother Teresa, right? The incredible work that she did. What a lot of people don't know is that Mother Teresa had a powerful experience with the silence of God that lasted more than 2 decades. If Mother Teresa can't hear the voice of God, who in the world could? But she was comforted by her spiritual director, her spiritual counselor. And whoever thought about Mother Teresa having a spiritual director or a spiritual counselor? Someone who is seeking after the Spirit. But her spiritual counselor told her 3 things that we, all of us, need to hear. And if she needed to hear them, we do too. The first thing that we need to hear is that there is no remedy, no human remedy for this darkness. So what she found was that she was not responsible for it. The second thing we need to hear is that the close feeling with Jesus was not the only or even the primary evidence that God is present in her life. God's presence is found in the fruits of love, not a certainty. The craving for God is a sure sign that God is present. The craving for God is a sign that God is present. And the final thing that she needed to hear and that we need to hear is that the pain that she was going through can be redemptive. Day 2 pain that we go through can be redemptive. Jesus cried out, my God, in a moment of absence. Suffer redemptively by holding on in the darkness. Never let go. I have no idea who said this, but never doubt in darkness what God has shown you in the light. Never doubt in darkness what God has shown you in the light. And so the question for all of us, because as human beings, we're all going to have a day two. What will we choose in our day twos? Will we choose despair? Will we choose denial? Will we choose rage, a rage that leads to detaching from all that actually gives life? Will we choose to sit in darkness alone, or will we wait? Will we wait with him? If I complain to him and with him. Think of all of the laments and all the psalms, which really are people in a day two time, a day two period, shaking their fists at heaven, maintaining that connection. There was a book that came out, then a movie was made. It was a terrible movie. The book was, but it had a real movement in our society. Do you remember the book Heaven is for Real? The story of, and the pastor who wrote that, I had a member at one of my churches that was her hometown pastor. So this was not somebody made up. I mean, she knows this guy. And in this little book, the father, who's a pastor, has a son who has died. Spoiler, the son comes back and talks about what happened in heaven. Hence, heaven is for real. But in this book, he locks himself in a room as day one, this worst day ever, slides into day two. And day one emotions are filled with thoughts. His day two emotions were filled with thoughts like, or the day two, the doctor blew it. Then it morphed into, it was my fault. How could I let this happen? And finally it got to the point, it was God's fault. And so in that little room, he rages against God. God, how could you do this to me? Is this how you treat your pastors? Where are you? Show your face. It was rage, to be sure. He owned it. He acknowledged it. Who here wouldn't rage at the loss of a child? But this wasn't a rage that was detached. It was a heartfelt, soul-filled cry of faith from one who was waiting on the Lord. He took it to God in prayer. And then he enlarged the prayer circle, remembering that intercessory prayers are heard. He writes that while he was in hell over his son's condition, his son was in heaven with Jesus and would come back with an incredible clarity and recollection. He clung to the promise that Jesus says, I will go through Friday, day one with you. I'll descend into hell for you. And here's where we find the key to Saturday, to day two. Jesus went to hell. Jesus went to Sheol. You know the Apostles' Creed? Crucified, dead, and buried. Descended into hell. And, most Methodist churches have taken that part out. To the Hebrew mind, Sheol was simply a state or an abode of the dead. It was not the same thing as a grave, though sometimes in older translations of Scripture, it's translated that way. The grave was the resting place for the body from which the spirit had departed, while Sheol was the resting place of the departed spirits or personalities. And so original Apostles' Creed says this is what happened on day two. He went to hell. He went to Sheol. Peter writes, for Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which also he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey. Peter writes just a chapter and a half later, for this is the reason the gospel was proclaimed even to the dead, so that though they had been judged in the flesh as everyone is judged, they might live in the spirit as God does. The golden-tongued one, John Chrysostom, in his great Easter sermon proclaimed, the prophet Isaiah foretold this when he said, you, O hell, were placed in turmoil when he encountered you below. And so John Ortberg and others said, what we see in this is that Jesus will go to any length to save anybody. He brings a grace so deep that it reaches everybody that has come after his earthly ministry and everyone before his earthly ministry. There is no suffering that you can go through that he won't endure. Jesus will go to any length to save anybody. And so the question is raised, do all roads lead to God? And the answer is, I don't know, but I do know that God will go down any road to find you. And why? Because you matter to God. Jesus defeats our great enemy, death, not by proclaiming his invincibility over it, but by submitting himself to it. So if you can find Jesus in a grave, if you can find him in death, if you can find him in hell, where can you not find him? Where can you not find him? Where will he not turn up? When does he consider it not to belong to him? So whatever your pain, whatever your rejection, whatever dream has died, whatever longing has not been fulfilled, whatever your failure, whatever your regret, whatever your shame, whatever your disappointment, it is not the end. It is only Saturday, and deliverance is coming. So do not give up. Do not despair. Do not deny, do not detach, do not waver, do not give in, do not quit, do not tank. And whatever you do, do not miss tomorrow. Because tomorrow is the third day. Day 3, a day of deliverance. Day 3 is God's day, and it is full of light. And in a dark day 1 world of crucifixion, let us as Easter people reflect the light of resurrection in all that we do. No one saw day 3 coming. In a third day story, you don't know it's a 3-day story until the third day comes. As far as you know, this day 2 is going to last forever. As far as you know, this trouble is going to go on and on and on. But we can laugh now because it's not a 2-day story. It's a 3-day story. And so even though we go to bed on day 2, Holy Saturday night, the good news is that tomorrow is Sunday, Easter Sunday, the third day. Thanks be to God. Amen. Hope to see you tomorrow in church, 8:30 and 10 o'clock.